Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you bright and early. And thank you immensely for coming to this event at this hour. So really appreciate it. And I'm delighted to be here with Marietje Schaake and Professor Andreas Krause, two members of the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory body on AI, of which I have the privilege to serve as member secretary. So today we're going to make very, very brief remarks so we can have more of a conversation. We want to hear from you, in particular about the work that we've been engaged on this past few months on governing AI for humanity. There is this report that was released by the advisory body just before Christmas. And I recognize just over there, Hiroaki Kitano. And Petri, where are you? There you are. Two more members of the advisory body. So a lot of hard work has gone into this. The 39 members of the advisory body met over 40 times in a very short period of time. And of course, they brought in a wealth of experience from different sectors, government, private sector, civil society, their own disciplinary expertise. So this was a design principle. We wanted to have multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary expertise inside the body. And they pooled it together and put together a report which I recommend that you read. We are not going to get into the details, but there's a framework that's been followed for facilitating an international reflection. And that framework looks at, of course, the exciting opportunities around AI. More importantly, what's needed to harness those opportunities. And Andreas is going to speak a little bit about that. There is also the question of risks and challenges. These are very powerful technologies, and there are implications, especially this year, with 60% plus of the world's population going to the polls. And in the WEF survey, number two in terms of risk perception is the misuse of these technologies to distort democracy, distort public expression of their democratic rights. And Marietje is going to go into that. And then the third area that we looked at was the institutional response to these opportunities, these risks and challenges. There is a national level layer that's very important, being engaged by the US through the executive order, China through its interim measures, the EU, most important, law-based AI Act. And then you have the layer where the industry is very active. And we have many industry participants here today. So the standards that are being set up, the risk management frameworks, and then there is a layer of international governance. So what should be done at that? What are the functions that need to be performed at the international level? And this report for the first time has suggested a framework for looking at those functions, 7 functions, and we'll get into that in a brief moment. But I do want to bring in our panelists right away. So starting with you, Andreas, if you can tell us a little more about the work you've done inside the body, along with Petri, Hiroaki, and others, on the opportunities and enablers side.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amandeep, for the introduction. Thank you all, also from my side, for coming at this early hour. It's really wonderful to see all of you here. We're really looking forward to your feedback on all these topics. So I was part of the working group that explored opportunities and enablers of advancing sustainable development through AI. That is also represented here by Hiroaki Kitano and Petri Mylimäki, so they can complement in case I missed some important points here as well. And so I'm just going to give a brief summary of some of the key points that we can maybe also use as a basis of discussion. Maybe a general realization, right? So there's certainly an appreciation of the fact that tech solutionism is not going to be the answer. We have to be careful, right? Also, right, in terms of expectations, what the technology can do. On the other hand, it's clear that there are tremendous opportunities with AI that are increasingly being realized. The report highlights several of them, from agriculture to health, education, others, spells out some efforts around addressing climate change with AI. There's also lots of discussions around the role that AI for science can play in advancing sustainability through materials discovery, sustainable chemistry, and other domains, and so on. So certainly lots of opportunities. There's also realization that the key enablers for modern AI, in particular data, talent, and compute, are not evenly distributed, and that, of course, creates major challenges that need to be addressed. And so, of course, now the key question is really how can international collaboration and global governance really help address these challenges, right? And that's, of course, the key topics that were discussed in the context. And so one potential approach that was explored here, again, with this idea of sort of form following function, right? It's one of the important governing functions, is models like kind of inspired by or distributed variant of CERN, right, that is reimagined for AI, that might help really federate and bring people together, jointly addressing global challenges for sustainable development in AI. That's sort of one model that's been discussed quite a bit. And one important function that international collaboration can really play. There's, of course, many challenges that need to be addressed in this context, where governance is crucially important in this context. Now, one important topic that's heavily discussed also here at the AI House and lots of other places is the importance of sort of open source and the role it plays. So there's certainly recognition that open source and sharing of data and models, quoting here from the report, can play an important role in spreading the benefits of AI and developing beneficial data and AI value chains across borders. On the other hand, of course, there's also a realization that sharing has to be done responsibly, right? And that governance can really be an important enabler in that aspect as well. So another aspect that's a bit more specific as well is that, in particular, given all the shortage of compute, right, and expense of training models and so on, there's a realization that at least sort of on shorter time horizons, training of large models, frontier foundation models, and so on, right, might be difficult to really scale globally in initial steps, right? On the other hand, aspects like adapting, fine-tuning models to local languages, local cultural contexts, and so on, is something that maybe can be achieved more realistically in sort of shorter terms. And one of the examples that is brought up there is a reference to the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, that sort of sets some examples of how this might look like, at least in shorter term contexts. Again, quoting from the report, mechanisms such as Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, may suggest short-term examples for ensuring that the benefits are shared. Repositories of AI models that can be adopted to different contexts could be the equivalent of generic medicines to expand access in ways that do not promote AI concentration and consolidation. And so even though the working group, of course, focused on opportunist enablers, there are some discussions of risk. And while, of course, there is an important risk of misusing the technology, there's also an important risk of missed uses of the technology, and that, of course, has to be kept in careful balance.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So that's the perfect segue to you, Marietje.
Thank you, Amandeep. Thank you, Andreas, and good morning, everybody. Let me just start by saying how joyful it has been to work with a group of around 40 people that really are, selected to be inclusive, representative of different disciplines, different geographical, but also professional backgrounds, lived experiences. And we've been working in crunch time. We were appointed late November? Late October, early November. So we cannot blame the UN for being slow ever again after looking at the timeline that we've been subject to. And it's been a great pleasure to be one of the two rapporteurs. And I think about the report that I really hope you'll read if you haven't already. I think about it as the sketch of a painting. The lines that are drawn are quite important, but they're not final and they're not very detailed. And so we are also now entering into a phase of reaching out, opening the doors, and asking for more input. So that's why we're here. Now, let me try to sort of touch on a couple of key points and then we can talk more. But the report starts from the perspective that governance is also an enabler of the use of technology. So we shouldn't think about governance in terms of, restricting innovation or the kinds of frames that we've often heard in the discussion about the role of regulation. And particularly the United Nations, with global membership, with deep, decade-long anchors, in respect for international law, respect for international human rights, and global representation are really informing us to focus on the unique role of the United Nations, which I think we should sort of keep in mind as our point on the horizon, because this discussion, as you all know, can go in endless directions, and it has, but then we try to bring it back to what are we here to do. And so when we look at what needs to be done, there's a couple of issues that recognize that market forces cannot and should not be trusted to solve all the questions around the role of technology in our societies globally. And so there are a number of recommendations to make sure that the public interest is protected. And this relates to how decision makers, for example, gain access to knowledge, which is now still often locked and inaccessible, also for academic research. I say as working at a university where my colleagues are often at a disadvantage compared to people in the private sector to analyze how these large language models work, what impact they have on society. Another very important anchor is to be truly global. We recognize in the report that many communities, many people, particularly in the global south, have not been a part of the discussions about what AI means for them, for their lives, opportunities, risks, maybe just mere questions of having access. If you don't have electricity, what are you gonna do about thinking about artificial intelligence? There are just major steps that many, many people in the world are still behind on. But certainly also in terms of, are their voices heard when we think about governance? Are there governments capable of having the kind of governance processes in place? And I think that's another challenge that we recognize, is that the capabilities of government, similar to what I just sketched about academics, to be up against very powerful companies and technology that races ahead, presents its unique challenges. And so that brings us back to this sort of principle-based approach, where the anchors of international law, human rights law, and the public interest are incredibly forceful. But we have to find new and also innovative ways to make sure that these principles can and will be respected in this ever-changing environment that AI is enabling. So I'll end there, but I hope that this is the start of a conversation with many more of you.
Thank you, Marietje. Now, I've been asked to say a few words on the functions and forms aspect, which has been exercising minds for a while now. Is there an IEA for AI? Is the IPCC the right model, etc.? So the advisory body took a conscious decision not to jump to institutional forms of governance. And I laid out that distributed vision that you have a role for the private sector, you have a role for governments at the national, regional level. So what's the minimum irreducible component of international governance? So we looked at that, did a gap analysis of 9 ongoing initiatives, GPA, the OECD work, the important work coming out of the G7 Hiroshima process, and so on. And then we also looked at these examples that have been cited of the international governance of technology over the decades. So what's really the meta side of that lesson? And came up with the principles that Marietje emphasized, the inclusivity principle, the principle around public interests, around data protection, data governance, and more importantly, around 7 functions of international governance. We put them in the shape of a pyramid to reflect that some of these functions would be harder to implement than others, being realistic. And what are the 3 kind of, I don't have time to go into all 7, but the 3 at the bottom layer are critical. One is a regular horizon scanning technology assessment in terms of its implications, function. That brings to mind the IPCC, but many other such forums and initiatives. The other is function related to interoperability of governance efforts, safety frameworks. You have these AI safety institutes coming up. So what brings them together? What kind of mediation of standards across the world do we need to be able to address the risk, but also for different innovators to be able to realize the opportunity. And then there is a function which Andreas went into, that's and you as well in terms of capacity development, enabling the good use through sharing, pooling of resources. So this distributed CERN vision. That is, I think, an essential element of whatever future form or set of forms fit these functions. And these are all now issues for debate. So this is an interim report. It's not the final report. So over the next 6 months, we'll have 3 in-person meetings in Geneva, in Singapore, in Africa, most probably in Nairobi, and many, many virtual meetings where we would like to dive deep into some of these issues and get advice, guidance before finalizing the report in time for the Summit of the Future in September this year. So with these introductory remarks, I want to open the floor to all of you. Let's bring in a few comments, 3-4 comments, very brief responses, and then continue the conversation. Who'd like to break the ice?
Hi, thanks a lot, Daniel Dobosch. Having had the honor to work at CERN and then also at the Global Humanitarian Lab with UNOPS, a lot reflects with me. We had very similar discussion of all kind of digitization. Talk about the UN cloud or Geneva cloud or many other things. And a lot of the key principles, I think, are not so different when we discuss about general compute or if we could talk now about AI and models. In all what you write up and all the process that you have seen, can you make me a little bit more hope that with AI, with the acceleration of AI, we also get some acceleration in the implementation of all what you write up compared to what we have seen in the general digitization and the, bringing access of compute to everybody? Do you think that also this will accelerate the speed that we can get access to for everybody around the world, not only to AI, but in general to all kind of information technology?
Thank you. And the catch box gets moved back over there. So we'll hold on to this thought about implementation. Are these reality-changing words or are these just words?
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Daniel Stauffacher from ICT for Peace. We see many processes now in the UN. And also AI is sort of impacting several areas. One is, we know AI is used in the battlefield, so it's a clear peace and security dimension. So we have maybe potentially the Security Council or the open-ended working group. And then we have the misinformation, disinformation debate where AI is the accelerator. And now your colleague, the Undersecretary General for Public Information, has launched also a process to think about that and think about norms or principles and so forth. So then we have these other processes like the Global Compact, the Summit for the Future. Could you explain to us how this at the end will all fit together? Thank you very much.
Thank you. How does it all come together? Okay. This side. Felipe, please. My colleague from the UN, Assistant Secretary General, who's just joined as the UN Envoy for Youth.
Thank you, Amandeep. Thank you for the invitation to be here. My comment is very briefly, and just for your reflections, half of the population in the world is under 30 years old. And accordingly to some studies we have at the UN, 68% of them think that technology is going to change their lives. No? You reflected about the importance of being this conversation. Governance is about trust. Institutions is about trust. In order to build trust, we should include the young voices into these conversations. And mostly, that doesn't happen too much, no? So I would ask you how technology also can bring us to bring more young voices, specifically from the global south, because most of these young people, most of this half of the population under 30 is in the global south.
Perfect. So bringing in the youth. Let's take one more and then. Stuart, welcome.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up on something that Andreas said about open source systems. And yes, there is an issue with misuse versus misuse, that open source can make technology available to people who might not have access otherwise. But I think viewing this as black and white, that it's either everything open or everything closed, is not accurate. There are ways of using closed systems to produce downstream products. And in fact, there are millions of developers doing that. The other point is that the victims of the misuse are not the ones who are benefiting from opening up the software in the first place. The companies that have an open source model are making money from it, and then the victims are somebody else who are victims of disinformation or fraud or whatever other uses people find for this technology.
Thank you. There's Stuart Russell. So maybe we can go back to look at these 4 areas, maybe starting with implementation first, and then the risks around that are coming along several fronts. And maybe I can talk about how does it come together, and then open source, bringing youth voices, we can go.
Great. Thank you. Let me try to address one from the perspective of what I see in our advisory body as discussions that are ongoing, and 2 is more personal observation. So I want to make a distinction between the 2. I don't think we have agreement within the advisory body that more access to AI is always positive. And so the report and our thinking is very much focused on, what are conditions needed to make it good for youth, good for disenfranchised communities, good for solving anything from climate change problems to major healthcare challenges to security threats that we all have to live with. But the most vulnerable communities, as Stuart hinted to in his question too, often suffer but have at the same time the least agency to change. And so we're not so much trying to look at this in black and white terms, in terms of more access is always a good thing. So this is also an invitation to all of you. If you have concrete examples of the way in which AI can be used for good, but also for harm, the more detailed and the more specific, the better for us to work with, so that we can also pierce through these sort of, hype and hysteria kind of frameworks that we think don't help many, but that are still quite prevalent. Then my own observation. What I think is different this time around, meaning around artificial intelligence, is sure, there can be a lot of criticism of governments, but I have never, and I've served as a politician for 10 years, never seen a topic where the acknowledgement of big impact, risk, and the need for governments to kick into action has been as firm and as fast as I've seen around AI. And so hopefully, I can only say hopefully, that means that there's a great sense of responsibility. And if looked at the glass half full towards some corporate voices, there's also acknowledgement of risk, maybe with different incentives, but still. So I can only hope that with lessons learned of being too slow with regard to previous technologies, both for beneficial or malign uses, that the action willingness on the part of governments is greater. Now, at the same time, while there's a great willingness to act, I think there are still a lot of questions about what to do. This is also something I've never seen before. Oftentimes, politicians know exactly what to do, and then they want to build majorities around it. Right now, I see people who are willing to do something, but they're basically asking people like us, what should we do? So we are trying to give them concrete, but also meaningful and principled handles to solve these problems with in their own context, but in a way that it also still fits together and we don't get incredible fragmentation that will be hard to overcome.
Thank you, Marietje. And I'm just, giving a heads up to Percy Liang over there. I'm going to come to you in the next round. And Julie behind there, you too. Okay. Andreas.
So do we go in order? Or I mean, I can
whichever
also maybe
person
directly
first.
respond to Stuart's comment, right? And of course, this is a very short summary, right? It was a very nuanced discussion. It's a very complex topic around open source, right? And that's very much appreciated by the working group, by the panel overall, right? So just to clarify this, right? And the question is really, what are the right norms for responsible sharing for realizing and harnessing the potential benefits that open source models can help in spreading? On the other hand, being acutely aware of misuse. So the comment about misuse versus misuse in particular is also in light of the fact that we're very much not on track in meeting the SDGs, and AI, while not the panacea, is at least one of the technologies that holds considerable promise in moving forward. So I just wanted to very much acknowledge, right, we didn't of course, asked to give a very short summary of the report and all the discussions around it. But very much appreciated. Thank you for bringing this up.
Thank you very much. And how do we bring it all together? I think all roads lead to the Summit of the Future, at least this year. The Pact on the Integrity of Information that you mentioned, that my colleague Melissa Fleming is leading on with help from UNESCO, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and my office. That's not a negotiated outcome, but it'll be taken into consideration in the Global Digital Compact, which has one of the agenda items as digital trust and security. Likewise, the questions around cybersecurity. The military applications, again, within the advisory body, we have different views. So we've reflected a certain view of concern, and the Secretary General has been very clear about some red lines where we don't want to go. And I think when we bring in the principles such as international human rights law, international humanitarian law, we kind of reinforce the readiness of those lines. So let's continue the conversation with another round since open source came up. This is one of the ideas where we are going to do a deep dive with some of you also present, and also leveraging a consultative group that's being put together to help the advisory body reach out more into networks, into areas of expertise where we may not have had the full advantage of having that expertise within the body.
There's also the question about the youth.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, that's for me. Right. So again, as part of the Summit of the Future, you have an outcome, one of the 5 outcomes that focuses on future generations and what youth can do, and your office itself, which is one of the early harvests from the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report, is now at a senior level, is tasked with bringing everything together on this. Within the advisory body, we have some very prominent youth voices, and they've been articulating in a fascinating manner considerations around education, around capacity, etc. And we would continue to dive deeper into that and do a youth-focused consultation in the coming months. Okay, let's have another round. Percy, you want to come in on open source?
Sure. Thanks for giving me the chance to talk, and thanks for the remarks. I would like to maybe start with saying that I think one of the major challenges in putting all together is the notion of trade-offs, because we have these principles of privacy, security, fairness, innovation, accessibility, not to mention the differing values that each country holds. And at the end of the day, we live in this shared world, and there has to be some sort of trade-offs. In order to make meaningful trade-offs, we need to quantify and more measure the actual the risks and benefits. So using open source as an example, clearly there are benefits of open source in terms of innovation, customizability, privacy, but then there are also risks. And at present, I think doesn't exist a good measurable way to quantify these concerns. Just for example, people have cited multiple types of risks, from disinformation to cybersecurity to biorisk. And one thing that I would urge everyone to think about is the marginal risk of open source as opposed to closed, as opposed to using the internet. And sometimes And also think about the whole ecosystem. It's not just a disembodied AI, but it's an AI that is perhaps used by an actor, but for example, in disinformation, you have to spread it on the platform. In biorisk, you have to manufacture the proteins. And thinking about that whole system together, that would give you a more realistic estimate of the risk. And if we can do that reliably, then I think we're standing on much firmer ground to make these difficult decisions.
Thank you so much. And we'll, in the next phase, dive deeper into the risk assessment. So this is one of the research streams inside the advisory body, these trade-offs that you mentioned. Julie, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julian Grant. I am the Australian E-Safety Commissioner. So we were the first online harms regulator set up in 2015, and I 100% agree. It has been a very lonely road where we've tried to create the playbook as we went along, and 2023 was really a tipping point. I think Amandeep understood early on an initiative that we brought about and consulted with industry on around safety by design. Many people thought because we had firm powers to regulate that was a soft approach. But we are going to see very different ways of regulating comprehensively. I think we're already seeing elements of AI nationalism, which very much reminds me of the digital sovereignty and cloud computing sovereignty we saw in Web 2.0. But we need to look up and down the stack, whether closed or open, and ensure that those who are developing, deploying, training through every part of the system and process are thinking about assessing the risks and building in the protections up front. I mean, even Sam Altman was saying in his first Senate testimony, we're kind of concerned about what's going to happen once this is extricated out into the wild. Well, I think we all know you can't put the genie back in the bottle once you have these large language models out there. So I really appreciate what you're trying to do to bring this together. I don't think we'll ever have, we don't want to splinter net here. We want to avoid fragmentation. I think the best we can do is probably to look towards regulatory coherence. And this is something that we're trying to achieve through the Global Online Safety Regulators Network. So now that the DSA has come on board, the Irish have an online harms regulator, Ofcom is regulating the UK, we have Canada looking at legislation, and elsewhere. We're hoping that regulators can band together. And that's another really important thing. Politicians and policymakers, particularly if they haven't worked in tech or understand how the technology industry works and what is in the realm of the possible and what good implementation looks like, I do worry we're going to have a lot of grandiose ideas that regulators can't actually implement.
Fantastic. And maybe in your responses, we'll go into this model of regulatory coherence through a networked approach. And I see two hands here. Gentleman at the back, please introduce yourself quickly, and then...
I'm Silvio Dolinsky from International Organization for Standardization. I just wanted to ask whether the high-level group has discussed the role of international standards in developing the global framework of governance for AI. Thanks. And what do you see there eventually, or in your opinion?
Right. So we get back to that in our responses. Please.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Aslihan. I am from a young woman based in Kyiv, Ukraine. And my question is actually more about the evolving role of UN when it comes to AI, but also more in the innovation and tech ecosystems. And the question comes up because the Ukraine is very active, and they are leading to digital transformation. And even like the amid the war, like despite everything. And the government of Ukraine right now, they are developing the national strategy for the development of the innovation ecosystems. And it is a strategy leading up to 2030. And we have been approached to review the draft strategy in the last month. And it wasn't an easy task for us because it already took a couple of days for us to figure out what is our positioning. And although it is like a daily task for us when it comes to other line ministries, and so I just wanted to ask, like, how do you see our role when it comes to providing support to the governments in this specific area?
Thank you. So this question around government capacity building around the world. Maybe we can reverse the order and start with you, Andreas, first. You want to respond to or reflect on some of these remarks?
Maybe not on the government capacity building, maybe you can comment more on that. Maybe let me take the question on standards. So this certainly has been part of the discussions. It's an appreciation also reflected in the report that standards play an important role, right, and also in ensuring compliance with regulation. So this is part of the outreach and consultation phase. So we're going to look into this specific aspects around the emerging standards around AI. So this is very much on the map. So thank you for bringing that up, that very important point.
Yes, and developing standards and mediating standards as they come up, developing common vocabulary around, and then I think there's a paradigm shift involved from technical standards to socio-technical standards. Some organizations, standard-setting organizations, are more advanced in that. You know, I know about some of the work that you're doing. Others may have to catch up.
Yeah, just briefly on Percy's point, and I think Julie's point is related in some ways. This is, again, a personal observation, but I think maybe an elephant in some rooms as well. A lot of the choices before us, trade-offs, if you will, are very political. And there's a, I think, hopeful effort to say that we have, you know, shared interests and we must find each other and we must avoid fragmentation, which I think is always a good thing, but that will not change the reality of different interests, different political systems. And I think that's another really important part of where trade-offs happen, different interests of different stakeholders. So what is an opportunity to create more national security for government can be an enormous threat for journalists, human rights defenders, or, you know, people who want to raise their voices or, you know, have critical words to say. So, you know, the same technology, depending on whose hands it lands into and what use case it's used for, can lead to very different outcomes. So what I think we are trying to do is to create shared understanding, which I think is what you're alluding to with regard to, you know, can we get to trusted risk assessments of various kinds that will then hopefully invite more joint approaches, because otherwise, if everybody starts to try to home in on some of these risks with varying capabilities, varying insights, you know, notably, again, significant power for the private sector as opposed to government, you know, that's not going to work. So I think you're pointing to a very important function that we have discussed, but that we should build out more, so that there's at least a sort of starting point from which we can all start discussing, and then, you know, inevitably politics will come in, but at least we've done our best to have an independent reading of how the technology evolves. Another question that comes up a lot is, you know, within which timeframes must we anticipate new breakthroughs of certain calibers? And of course, there are, you know, huge discussions between experts on whether this is going to happen within a couple of years or a couple of decades, and everything in between. So we hope to be able to rely on people like yourselves and other academics and experts around the world to bring together these views into having a sort of baseline of understanding.
Thank you, Marietje. And I think you made a subtle and very important point, which is that how do we look at risks? You know, do we start with, as the advisory body has done, from the perspective of vulnerability? Who are the most vulnerable communities or aspects of our life, the planet, for instance? Or do we start with kind of, you know, abstract and almost arbitrary division, short-term, long-term risk? So we've taken a certain approach, and we like to hear from all of you if that resonates, and if we can translate that into a kind of framework for continued risk assessment. Because behind the perception or projection of risk assessment may lie interests. So we want to avoid that, given that this is the UN setting. The other question around government capacity building, I think, again, how does it all come together in the context of the Global Digital Compact? This is a major issue that the Secretary General has highlighted through his policy inputs into the Digital Compact process. So by the time we come to the Summit of the Future, we want to make sure that the frameworks, the understandings, the principles-based understanding, as was emphasized earlier, is there to invest more in government capacity building in a distributed, networked sense, because Ukraine is doing great things. There's the DI app in a very difficult situation. Other countries have leveraged the digital transformation to transform the delivery of government services. So how can we pool these case studies and turn them into training content and deliver them in a distributed way? How can we bring in a more nuanced understanding of data and AI? It's leveraging its governance being an enabler. So that's going to be a major next step. Okay, maybe we have time for one last round of comments. So I see hands going up. The green box goes to this gentleman and then moves around.
Thank you so much for all your comments. My name is Manas Chavla. I lead London Politica, and I'm part of the OpenAI Red Teaming Network. And the theme this year at Davos is all about rebuilding trust. And all of the proposals I've heard about sort of what multilateral institutions to model AI governance on, whether that's IPCC, whether that's Basel, whether that's the IEA, all have fundamentally a trust problem, whether that's at the political level, and especially given the events of last night, seeing as Donald Trump might well be on his way to office again, or at the grassroots level. And so I'm wondering if you really want a multilateral, international, global solution to AI, what are the obstacles in the form of that sort of trust gap, and what do you think international institutions can do proactively to mitigate that?
Next one. Thank you. Just behind me, yes. Yes.
My name is Hail, and I work in the domain of cybersecurity for over 2 decades with intersection with AI, from applying them to deploying them. I was just reading from Cambridge Dictionary, governance is the way that organizations or countries are managed at the highest level and the systems for doing this. So with all due respect, if UN has failed to stop many conflicts between humans, how do you see UN would govern AI, which would be autonomous, unstoppable in future conflicts? And we see this now, that AI has been used in conflicts. So how can we govern this, in your view? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Gill. I'm from the private sector, and I was wondering, what ways are you thinking about economic upsides and the allocation and sharing of it? Because AI is an emerging technology that will create a lot of wealth for the next generations to come. But are there any thoughts about how we can have models in place that don't lead to the fact that the gap in those who have and those who have not won't widen? Thank you.
Digital divide. And we go to the back to Eva Middle from the European Parliament.
Thank you so much. Eva Mijdel, member of the European Parliament, one of the people of the European AI Act. Thank you for convening us today here. You spoke about the interoperability of government efforts, and I believe in your report you talk quite a bit about common benchmarking, and this being one of the impediments. I've pushed very hard to get that in the European AI Act in order for benchmarking standards to work alongside other bodies such as NIST, but it might sound somewhat technical, but I'm wondering if we can't measure it. We have no way, I believe, to implement it. So I'd like your comment on that. And then on the various government efforts, there's a little bit, I guess, in the report on that, but when you've measured what OECD, the G7, the EU, and others are doing, could you share a little bit more? How much are we converging or diverging in our efforts? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had time for only this many questions, so I'll go back to our panelists, starting with Marietje.
Okay. Thank you. I want to pick up on the question of trust. I think it's a delicate balance to strike to refer to past institutional experiences while we're dealing with technology that's in many ways unprecedented and that will manifest itself into the future. So I don't think it will hold us back into thinking about new, needed ways to operationalize some of the principles that we're talking about. But we need more time to get to, either one or a combination of existing new institutions, we don't know. But I think one way to build more trust that has certainly been absent is to have that much more global discussion. So a lot of the institution building, but also the global politics in general, have been steered with a very Western developed economies kind of perspective. And one of the things I'm most optimistic about, both in terms of the unique role that this AI advisory body can play, but also about the discussions we have with a variety of people on the body, is this very clear focus on having this being a more representative discussion. And I'll jump to Eva's question. There is no one in our advisory body who wants to repeat the good work that others are doing. So we reference the various initiatives that you also reference. But what we try to do is to focus on the unique role of the UN. And indeed, maybe I can say this, I hope I'm not insulting anyone, but the UN, of course, has no flawless track record at all. At the same time, what other body has global membership and has a charter in which principles are laid down clearly? The problem is, of course, enforcement in many contexts, right? A principle is only as strong as the means and political will to make sure that it's actually lived up to and that there are consequences for those who don't. And that, I don't know if you were here for the previous discussion, but I hinted briefly at the inevitable political differences between global actors. And I think what we can do as best as we can as a global advisory body is show what can be done on the basis of principles with this very rapidly evolving new technology in a way that seeks to not be contributing to fragmentation, but rather to unification on the basis of those principles. But ultimately, we are not going to be the enforcers. We have to be realistic about that. So it would also be great if you feel strongly about what needs to be done, let us know. And let the people who do have that enforcing power know that you expect them to live up to the principles that they have almost universally signed up to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marietje. Andreas? Is there any reflection that you will have on what you heard this round?
Yeah, so I don't think I have any too specific comments on the points that were brought up. Of course, aspects around benchmarking and red teaming and so on were intensely discussed, right? I think are important mechanisms to try to assess model capabilities. On the other hand, they are flawed as well, and that's also a realization of this. Really understanding carefully, and that's also relating to Percy's point, right? The various dimensions of these trade-offs, various objectives and constraints is just very difficult, right? And there's important research challenges that need to be addressed still, I think, along many of those, right? To really understand capabilities of these models. One important aspect is transparency, right? To really assess capability of these models. It's very difficult to do, right? Unless there's more transparency about, for example, data and so on. Overall, I think this is a very, very complex topic, of course, and it's very much on the map that requires further discussion and further research.
Yes, absolutely. And it's in that in the pyramid, you'll see it in the third and fourth layers. So there's a lot that has to be done in any case. You're developing very powerful technologies. So big deal, you have to do red teaming, you have to do safety testing. But how do we make sure that it's done at a level where you have that trust flowing from transparency, flowing from following benchmarks that are really the gold standard? So I think that's where we want to focus our attention on. And I want to respond following what Marietje said on the UN's role. So never perfect, because the way it's designed, sometimes you have these gaps in accountability, impunity, coming from the most powerful, who sometimes sit on the Security Council, can block decisions. So, I have no hesitation in calling that out. But that's how sovereign governments around the world have chosen this framework. And within that framework, there is plenty of room for maneuver, for creativity, for expanding the space for multi-stakeholder dialogue and action, for bringing in new areas as gender has come in, as youth has come in, as environment and climate change have come in, mostly in the 21st century. So I see this as a very important moment in time. We can go back into these kind of narrow nationalist approaches when every challenge we face today is globalized, crosses borders, and nothing illustrates that more than data and AI and everything digital. So we've chosen to be optimistic, and we've chosen to be principled about the UN's role, and careful about advocating more bureaucracy and the old ways of doing things. So that's why the recommendations are open-ended. Now we will of course look at the institutional form of these functions based on those design principles, based on the framework that we have, looking at opportunities, risks, and governance broadly. And I think it's a challenge for all of us. We've already started to get feedback. For instance, last week we heard in New York that yes, you have this important principle around data, but can you reflect it in the functions as well? How does that translate into a functional aspect at the international level? So that's what we are looking from all of you. Specific areas, be critical, engage with us, help us co-create. Co-creation would be another way to enhance that trust so that we get to a better, more creative outcome that lifts up multilateralism and collective global action as well. So thank you very much. I think we are on time, maybe a minute early. That might give you a little more time for networking, for getting some nourishment. And I just want to thank ETHZ Zurich for the excellent collaboration with the Office of the Secretary General's Tech Envoy, and our hosts at the AI House for allowing this excellent conversation to take place in such a congenial setting. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the Davos week.